Booker,
Dan Fellers,
Angie Goro,
Dorothy Red.
John Butita.
excellent. We've got a quorum. Okay, moving on right away to public comment. Is there anyone on line that has public comment? Hearing none, I'll move on to item D. It's a resolution extending the intergovernmental cooperation agreement for police services with the Village of McChesney Park for all the way to June 30th. This was extended from April to May, and evidently McChesney Park isn't ready yet. So looking for another extension to June 30th. Are there any?
so moved.
Moved by Dan Fellers, second by
Angie Goro.
Angie Gurl and Dorothy Red. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor of extending this agreement to June 30th, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. And that is it. Any other matters that anyone wants to bring up? Hearing none. Can I get a motion? Got Dan Fellers to motion to adjourn. A second. Dorothy
Second.
Red. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye.
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 Public Safety Committee is adjourned. Thank you.
That was easy, wasn't it?
You're sufficient, Mr. Booker. You're getting really good at this.
Yeah.
Whew. Just ran in the door too.
Are you there, Mr. Fiducia?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. I'm looking at the names. I think we should have a quorum for finance and I believe personnel as well. Yes, Mr. Webster just joined. So I think we'll get started. I'll kick it off, Mr. Fiducia, and then if you want to jump in, go ahead at any time. So I'd like to call to order the combined meeting of the Finance and Personnel and Policies Committee. Today's Thursday, May 21st. It is 5:35. And so I'll take roll call. Mr. Salgado present, Mr. Fiducia,
Present.
Mr. Hoffman,
Present.
Mr. Gurl,
Present.
Mr. Schultz, Mr. McDonald. I don't know if I see him on the line. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster, present, right?
Here,
Okay.
yes.
Ms. Red. Ms. Red,
Here.
thank you. Mr. Kelly,
Here.
thank you. And let the record reflect, we do have a quorum. And our next item is approval of the February 6th, June 20th, 2019 minutes of the combined finance and personnel policies. Can I get a motion and a second? Mr. Hoffman and Mr. Gurl, thank you very much. Questions on the minutes? Seeing none, all in favor, please signify by saying aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, the ayes have it. Thank you very much. We'll move on to our next item, which is public comment. Is there anyone, Mr. Chapman, that signed up to speak on this committee today?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We'll omit the public comment and move on to our next item, which is a resolution affixing compensation and other benefits for certain elected county officials. Can I get a motion and a second? Mr. Hoffman, a motion. Mr. Gurl, second. Thank you. Discussion, Mr. Chapman, would you like to elaborate a little bit on the numbers that you submitted to us, and then we can see if there's any questions.
Okay, thank you. I did send out this, I believe, to all the committee members. I think it was Tuesday or Wednesday. And I think I explained a little bit what we needed to do. There's 3 officials that are up that need the county board to approve salaries before, I think it's June 3rd. It has to be done 180 days, I believe it is, before the election. Those positions are county auditor, county coroner, and county board chairman. Normally you would have the county recorder in there also, but since that position is being dissolved as of November 30th, that would not be included. The county auditor, the proposed salary as of December 20th or December 1st, 2020 is $87,000. It would remain the same for the following year, and then go up by the cost of living up to 3% the following year, the same the year after that. The county coroner would go up to $92,765 plus a vehicle. We assign a vehicle to that individual. Same salary in 2021, and then the cost of living the last 2 years. County board chairman salary would be $95,658 plus a vehicle, which is the same as the current salary. That would stay the same for the 2 years and then go up the last 2 years. As far as the, let's see here. Oh, I have some numbers here. As far as the fiscal impact for the next year's budget, because the salaries don't go into effect till December 1st, so you're only paying 10 months of these increases. I think it turns out to be about $8,500 for the 2 individuals where the salaries would go up. So.
Any questions for Mr. Chapman or for discussion? Mr. Fiducia and then Mr. Schultz.
Thank you for the discussion. I'm just wondering, I know we're in a search for a new county administrator, and I'd like to propose to reduce the county board chairman's wages by $10,000 and go ahead and put that towards the put it in a fund and at least maybe have it sit there, so that way we get the best possible bang for our buck with the administrator. And I wouldn't be opposed to, giving a cost of living on top of that, but I think the administrator, from what I'm seeing, I think we need to look at the administrator's salary as being something that would be quite essential. So it's just a thought that because I know financially we're probably going to be hurting.
Thank you, Mr. Fiducia. Mr. Chapman, as a follow-up to that, do we know what the county administrator salary is at this point?
I believe it's budgeted for 140,000. I don't know what you're going to end up paying a new one, so it's hard to say.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Fiducia. We'll take that into account with the discussion right now, and then if that's something that this body feels it's appropriate, we'll move that direction if that's okay. So I'll go to Mr. Schultz, and then we'll have that discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of comments and then a question. One is just wondering if, because there's been dialogue around the possibility of the county board chairman going to a part-time position, if we want to have some language in here that says something like, in the event that we could say any of these positions, or specifically state the county board chairman position becomes a part-time position, then the salary for that would be prorated based on the number of hours that would be worked. So something along those lines that would not force the issue, but would accommodate it if there was a change. And I have no idea, honestly, how much momentum that possibility has, but at least it would be a provision for that. And then the second comment is just that if that were to be the case, that might impact the be it further resolved where it talks about the benefits. And in that benefit paragraph, it says that retiree health insurance coverage is included in this. And I guess I'd like to know more about whether or not, okay, someone could serve, for example, a 1-year term in one of these positions and have their, is it paid for them, or is it just be a participation in a voluntary where they have to pay the premium?
Go ahead, Mr.
Okay, thank
Chapman.
you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The retiree insurance for any county employees is 100% paid by the employee. The county does not pay for any coverage for the retiree. It's up to them if they want to choose to take our policy or, you know,
Okay.
get some other coverage.
Yeah, that answers that. Then the question, I guess, for Steve, it would be whether or not, if we do add language as a contingency for the position of county board chair to go part-time, would we also need to change anything in that benefit on a contingent basis so that we'd have language in that paragraph as well? So that would, because I know that where I work, we don't pay less, the part-time people don't get the benefits, right? So I don't know if that
I
would
guess
also
it,
be
I guess it would depend as far as the health insurance goes. I think our minimum hours that have to be worked, I think, is 30, 32. So I guess that might be an issue if it went to part-time. They wouldn't be eligible for the health insurance.
All right. So then, and then the question was just, okay, what are the current salaries for these 3 positions?
Okay, let's see here. Hang on a second. Okay, the county board chairman is it's the same salary as what's recommended for that first year. The county auditor is $81,284. The county coroner is $88,176. Those particular salaries have been frozen for the last 4 years with no increases. Previous to that, the term starting in 2012, I think the raises averaged about 0.6%. So they weren't very significant back then either, but that's the amount.
Follow up, Mr. Schultz?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I would be interested in whether a part-time adjustment in the language would be unnecessary, in that it would be assumed that if that role changed to part-time, then it would just be paid at a prorated amount. I guess I just offer that as I don't know.
Mr. Kurlinkas, from your perspective, what do you recommend in case to address Steve Schultz's question? Say, for example, the county board decides, you know, the county chairman, job becomes a part-time position, and how can we address it? Do we need to include language in there, or at any time we can go back and alter obviously this ordinance here for that resolution?
I would want to take a look at that, Mr. Chairman, to see exactly how that would go. But I do caution you that once a salary for an elected official is set, you cannot change it during the term of that elected official's office. That's a constitutional issue. So changing something once the term has begun back to part-time or doing anything like that would definitely, constitute a change in compensation, which is just prohibited by the Illinois Constitution. So you would not be able to do that.
Okay. Mr. Kelly, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be real problematic to try and go from full-time to part-time midterm.
Thank you. Anyone else? Questions, discussion? So the question still arises for Mr. Schultz. If that's a possibility, I guess we kind of have to make a decision here if we're going to lay the foundation right now for a full term, essentially. So let's talk a little bit amongst ourselves and see. At this point in time, I don't know if it's premature or not, unless we kind of have something concrete in that. But I'll go to Mr. Arena, and then let's think about that and let's move forward. Go ahead, Mr. Arena.
Chairman. I was having difficulty opening the packet. So just for clarification, the increase in wage to the chairman is just a cost of living increase, or is it a jump and then cost of living, or how is that structured?
Go ahead, Mr. Chapman.
Okay, for the chairman, the salary stays the same for the first 2 years. And the third year, it's the salary plus a cost of living up to 3%, depends upon the cost of living that the state gives us for our PTEL extension. It's the same cost of living. The fourth year would be a cost of living on top of that also. But the first 2 years, the salary is the same as what's currently being paid.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kurlinkus, once again, let me ask a different question, similar question, but different way. So if we want, so say for example, the county board decides, or that this becomes a part-time. So does that mean that we have to make the adjustment prior to that person is elected, or prior to the election? How does that work? Timing aspect of it. I just want to give us the chance if we do, if we don't. So, and I understand that it might discourage maybe potential individuals from actually seeking election for this, if it goes from a full-time to a part-time position. But I just want to ask those questions because I'm sure that's part of the discussion. And I'll go to Mr. Kurlinkus, then Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chairman. If your question is, does it go with when the person is elected or when they take office or something like that? I'm really not sure when the determination made, when the determination of when they're elected makes, when that's established. I think Steve is looking at this as being what the next, the elected chairman, Steve, if you correct me if I'm wrong, the elected chairman who's elected on November 3rd of 2020. That's what you're setting the salary for.
Yes.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes, and that has to be set according to law 180 days ahead of the
Right.
time that they take office.
Right, exactly. So and once that salary is established and that period at 180 days before the election, it cannot be changed. The compensation cannot be changed for the 4-year term for which that person is elected. So I guess you're going to have to make a determination fairly quickly. Steve, when's 180 days?
Well, we have to take action at this meeting.
Okay, so that's it.
That's all that. Mr. Kelly.
Exactly. Just what I was gonna point out, we gotta make up your mind. If you want part-time, you gotta do it now. Set the pay and see if anybody still wants to run for it.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Fiducia, you had your hand up, and then Mr. Girl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As far as part-time goes, I could support that idea, but here's the problem. I don't think we're going to able to, come to agreement on that with this board. But what I'm looking at is over a 4-year period or whatever, I would rather take the money that the chairman's getting and use that towards, possibly getting a quality administrator in there. Maybe, cutting it back down or something, because here's where the problem's coming at, in my eyes, is we don't know what we're going to get. It's like a box of chocolates now. We never know what we're going to get it for money out there. Let's try and be as little frugal as we can. I'm sure even if we cut that salary by $10,000, it's a livable wage, definitely a livable wage. It would be less than what some electeds are making now. So it's just a thought, but it's going to be more. It's going to reflect more on the new board than us now. But I'm thinking maybe do the right thing now.
Thank you, Mr. Fiducia. Mr. Girl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say that maybe we should have had this conversation months ago, the day of the hour that we're got to pass the compensation and the salaries. Now we want to have a conversation about making this a part-time position. Where was this during the subcommittees that Fiducia appointed Paul Arena to? Where was the discussion then? So, stupid. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Schultz, you had your hand up.
Yeah, well, thank you for that stupid comment, Bert. That was pretty rude. But the reality is we have been talking about the potential of this being a part-time position. And we've talked about it for months. And it's not my fault that we're having to decide tonight. This is the first time that this issue has been brought to any entity, including the Finance Committee. So the conversation has been had as regard to having to make the decision tonight as to whether it's going to be a part-time position or a full-time position. I'm in agreement that having to decide that on a hair trigger at the last minute, as far as not having adequate conversation about it. I also find it ironic that you're running for the position and you have such a strong position that you're taking. If I were in your shoes, I wouldn't even be speaking to the issue of salary at all.
You can speak to salary.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Girl, as a follow-up.
Yeah, I don't think I ever mentioned the word salary about the chairmanship, and I wouldn't. So I just, instead of stupid, let's just say the timing is poor. And that's all I'm saying, is that if we want to have this conversation at a finance committee at the 11th hour, instead of having conversations in caucus meetings and amongst ourselves, the part-time conversation was brought up by Mr. Webster, I believe, but it was never discussed further by anybody else, as far as I know. So thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Arena, and then Mr. Webster. I hear him in the background. So go ahead, Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Chairman. I agree with that. On the ad hoc committee with Mr. Arena, that the idea was put forward, talked about it some, and as I remember it was pretty much everybody against it, but going part-time but one. So the talks that we've had have been leaning towards a full-time chairman. And I think if we're going to talk about anything else, we should be talking about what happens when we have an absentee chairman. Why do they continue to get paid the amount of money they're getting if they're not working? So I think that's more appropriate conversation to have than talk about a part-time and a full-time chairman right now. Thank you.
Yes, we'll go to Mr. Arena, then Mr. Webster, then Mr. Fiducia, and then Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I just wanted to confirm what Mr. Hoffman just said. The ad hoc committee discussed the idea of a part-time chairman, and a recommendation when we issued our report was that the chairmanship should stay full-time based on the majority opinion of that committee. And it's clearly just advisory, but we did have extensive conversation on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Webster?
Yes. as opposed to defining it part-time versus full-time, that's not the way that I characterized it. I was talking about us going to the true township form of government, where we choose one of our own out of this body, out of the county board members, to be the chairman for a 2-year term. That's the way that true township government works. So you have 20 board members. The chairman then is a board member, a voting board member. And so this came up because the discussion was because we had relieved this current chairman of a number of responsibilities. And so the discussion came around the fact there that, you know, he was never around or whatever. And so it's like, how much do we really need to pay someone there when the responsibilities have been lessened? Then should not the wages be reduced as well? I mean, salary commensurate with experience and time, you know. So that's where that came about. And I don't think we're done with that discussion about going to the true township form again. The number of hours that a person works, that could be figured out there as well at that time. But I think that the state's attorney, a question for the state's attorney, if we were to go for a true township form of government, that could wait for another period of time, like 2 more years or something. Is that correct?
I'll turn it over to Mr. Kurlinkis, and maybe he has additional question to answer your question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This would be a 4-year term. I don't think you can make an adjustment. You certainly can't make an adjustment on the compensation midterm. You know, and going to whether you're calling this true township form or whatever after 2 years, I think that would be pretty dangerous. You might be able to do it, but I'm not 100% positive that you could. You're setting compensation and probably, you know, duties. Well, not duties, but you're setting compensation definitely for 4 years. You can't.
Sure.
Once you make that determination, as Mr. Chapman said at the county board meeting next week, that's it for 4 years. You cannot change that.
Yeah, thank you. I understand that. So thank you. What I'm getting at there is, let's say that we know this is a 4-year term, okay? But what I'm asking there is, let's say 2 years down the road from now, the sitting county board then, or 18 months or whatever, decided that in 2024 we should revert back to a true township form. What would be the the time frame that we would have to do that? Would it have to happen 180 days before that 4-year term is up, or what?
Yeah, I think that's why you're having this discussion now. Steve stated that it's the compensation portion of that would have to be made 180 days before the November 2024 election.
That's what I wanted to get straightened out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Mr. Fiducia?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Mr. Arena and Mr. Webster basically made the clarifications that I wanted to make. And just so Bert knows, I've been called worse things than stupid. So it ain't gonna bother me. But like Forrest Gump says, stupid is as stupid does.
All right, thank you. Anyways, moving on to Mr. Kelly. He had his hand up.
I'll pass. Mr. Kurlinkis answered everything.
Thank you. Any more discussion, comments on this item? Yes, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, in Mr. Webster and myself, we've had talks about going back to township. I think we're late in the game for this go around.
Yep.
I'm also optimistic that either person running for county board chairman this time, maybe they can do a great job. I would be in support of maybe not so much give them a raise, take away the car, but leave it at a full-time type wage or similar to what we currently have, and then make our, I think Mr. Kurlinka says 2024 plans, or if we're going to really dial back and go to a township style and look at it that way, I think it's definitely something worth looking at. But for right now, I'm optimistic that either one of these gentlemen will do a terrific job.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you very much. Any other questions, comments, concerns, discussion? Mr. Girl, yes.
Thank you, Chairman. I just want to say I wasn't calling anyone stupid. I was referring to the conversation. That was all. Thank
Yes,
you.
point well taken. Thank you, Mr. Girl, on that. Any more questions, comments, concerns before we take a vote? Yes, Mr. Hoffman.
One other suggestion, that bringing up about the car, there was some controversy over when we changed the rules of the car. We may want to look at that issue again before we get somebody new in, because I think we may have restricted the use of the car too much, and we maybe need to look at that. Just an idea.
Thank you, Mr. Hoffman. Mr. Fiducia?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it's my understanding nobody's interested in saving a few bucks on this position, or is it, so, you know, no disrespect to Mr. Girl or any candidates that are running for this, but it's a livable wage. Even if we cut it $5,000, we'd still save the county some money. And that's what I'm looking at down the road. So if, you know, I'd like to someone to entertain that, or see if I can get any traction for anybody to entertain something like that. So that way we could just save a little bit of money, because this is not going to be, it's a different world, I think, out there, or at least for the next 5 years, hopefully.
Thank you, Mr. Fiducia. I'll come back to you. First, I'll go to Mr. Girl, and then if you want to propose something, we certainly can entertain it. But I'll go to Mr. Girl.
Thank you, Chairman. A thought I had, and this was a while back, was about the vehicle that was given to the chairman, and whether or not, if we just took that away and provided the chairman with a vehicle from the carpool, that would save a lot of money there. So I think we have plenty of vehicles in the carpool. I don't see why a designated vehicle for the chairman is necessary. I'm sure Mr. Shirelli and myself both have vehicles that we can get back and forth, and if we need one, there's plenty in the carpool. So that's an idea, way to save money too. Thanks.
Yeah, Mr. Chapman, I thought maybe I saw your hand up. Unmute your. There you go.
I know we've had issues in the past relative to the vehicles and that, going back many terms here, but I guess it just has to be understood that if I think the understanding is now with the vehicle, it's pretty much available to that individual 24/7. And if that's not the case, then that has to be made clear as to, you know, what it's actually available for. So.
Okay. Real quick, Mr. Chapman, since I know Mr. Fiducia kind of made a comment about potentially reducing it 10 to 5,000. I know you said 140,000 is the county administrator salary at this point.
Yes.
Okay. So keep that in mind. I don't know. Have we vested time with our consulting firm to see whether that's a doable? I know we had a conversation potentially about compensation, but is that something that's reasonable, about the 140 range? Mr. Arena, I think, has this question, probably the answer to this question, but go ahead, either one, Mr. Chapman or Arena. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, we have had the conversation with the workplace about compensation, and, you know, we have that as a target amount, but I think we also have to be mindful of the fact that, you know, we could find an excellent candidate who's making more than that elsewhere. And if we really want to, you know, attract somebody, I doubt whether they're going to come here for a pay cut. So we need to be flexible on that point, which I guess kind of is a point in favor of Mr. Fiducia's suggestion to reduce the chairman's wage. But on the other side of that, I think we all need to keep in mind that the chairman's duties are fluid, right? The chairman's duties change, you know, subject to what the board needs. So there might be a point in time where we have to assign more tasks to our next chairman. And if we're going to increase the workload, is it fair if we've reduced the salary? I mean, I don't know that I'm firm in my mind on one way or the other, but it's just another way to think about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McDonald, I don't know if you had your question or, okay, all right. So Mr. Fiducia, I'll leave it up to you. If you get a second, that's fine. If not, we move on. So it's up to you, your call, whatever you want to do.
Well, I guess maybe it's not going to hurt. It's not going to hurt my feelings if I don't get a second on it, but I'll throw it out there.
Okay, so there's a motion on the floor to reduce the chairman's salary by $10,000. Is that correct, Mr. Fiducia, on the dollar amount?
You know, we could even make it 5. I want to save anything we possibly can. And I guess I have another question too. Isn't that part of the salary? I've had a car from my workplace, but I had to leave it there usually. But isn't the car like supposed to be part of a salary compensation package too? I thought they changed some laws on that.
Mr. Chapman, do you want to answer that real quick?
Well, the vehicle is in essence additional compensation. Is to the salary and so on. I just want to make one comment about the chairman's salary, because I know I've gone through these discussions many times, and I think part of the point was the county board chairman in terms of duties and that, even though they may have been changed, is still considered the chief elected officer of the county, and such that he should actually end up making more than what the other elected officials are. And I think that's been the theory in the past. So take it for whatever it's worth.
Yeah. Before that, Ms. Red, I don't know, do you have a question? Or I see your hand, so I just want to make sure I come to you. Can you unmute your button? Ms. Red, can you unmute? Are you talking to us or something?
No,
I
I'm
didn't
sorry.
know you had your hand up or you're talking to someone else.
No, I was going to second Mr. Fiducia's motion.
Okay, so Mr. Fiducia, I'll go back to you. Do you want to make that motion or do you want to just let it go at this point in time? It's your call, and then, see if we get a second or not. Go ahead, Mr. Fiducia.
Well, in light of Mr. Chapman's conversation and Mr. Arena's conversation, I don't want to cut that position short down the road, but my only concern is the financial well-being of this county, because I'll still be living here for a bit anyways, and that's the only reason I would make that. But on the light of what Mr. Chapman said, Mr. Arena said, I'll withdraw my motion.
Okay.
I withdraw my second.
All right, thank you very much. So we have a motion on the floor. Any more discussion? Mr. Schultz, yes.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this, Mr. Chairman. The vehicle does seem to have been a controversial issue. So I do think the idea of pulling that from this specific document would be a good idea. And I do disagree with Mr. Chapman's characterization of the chairman being the chief elected official. I think that's old way of thinking. That's not the township, selected out of the midst. I think it lends itself toward a, executive branch type thinking, and that's not what we have. So that's for what it's worth. But I'd make a motion to pull the vehicle from the compensation package.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Girl, and Mr. Fiducia. Thank you very much. So there is a motion of budget amendment to remove the vehicle out of the chairman's position and leave the other 2 items the way they are on the current policy there. So this discussion. Yes, Mr. Girl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess my question is for Mr. Karlinkus, and I think I know the answer, but I just want to be sure. Would this be something I should abstain? Only because I may have an interest in it if elected? I don't know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think for the reasons you just stated, it probably would be a good idea if you did abstain from this vote.
Okay, if the chairman can note that, and I'll abstain from this vote. Thank you.
All right, well, reflect that Mr. Girl is abstaining from the vote. Anyone else discussion, questions? Seeing none, all in favor of the budget amendment relayed by Mr. Schultz, removing the vehicle from the chairman position and leaving the two other items the way they are. Signify say aye or raise your hands.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, the ayes have it. So we'll go back, Mr. Karlinkus, we have to go back and vote on it again. Is that correct?
Use my. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe, yeah, now you've changed the compensation package by removing that. So I would say you would need to vote on the amended compensation package.
Okay.
Steve, you agree with that?
Yes.
All right. So now we are back. We're gonna talk about the budget amendment that was made, amending the county chairman vehicle, taking it out, leaving the other two positions. Is there any other discussion regarding this at this point in time? Seeing none, all in favor, signify by saying aye. Or raise your hand. Opposed? All right, the ayes have it. Thank you very much. We'll move on to our next item, which is, and give me 1 sec here while I get back my bearings here. Next item is a resolution authorizing the chairman of the county board to execute an agreement with GovTemp USA LLC. Can I get a motion and a second? Motion by Mr. Girl, a second by Mr. Hoffman. Thank you. Discussion, Mr. Chapman.
Okay, thank you. The current agreement with GovTemp USA for the interim administrator expires on June 5th. And this would actually extend it for 2 months with a possibility of an additional 2 months. The other thing is you have the out clause is either party can terminate it with 2-week notice. So if you hire somebody and want to get rid of me, then you can give them 2-week notice and it's done. So.
Thank
but
you.
we need to do this at this meeting because it expires on the 5th.
Correct. Mr. Kelly.
Glad you're here, Steve.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions regarding this item? Seeing none, all in favor, signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? All right, the ayes have it. Thank you very much. Next item, personnel, other personnel matters. Is there anything else that we'd like to discuss? Mr. Fiducia?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a matter that was brought up to personnel and policies. Reference the response from the airport director. I believe Dorothy has some comments, and I believe Mr. Arena has some comments reference that, and I'll elaborate on the I believe his name is Shablaski. I'll elaborate on that too, just a bit too. But if there's anybody that wants to go ahead and bring up, because what was given to me was what the director of the airport gave Mrs. Red was inappropriate. There's just no doubt about it. It was inappropriate. But I think that it was said before that that's just something, that's just the way he is. And that's all I can say. I think he does a marvelous job out there, but I don't feel right what he did to Dorothy, but I just think, okay, shame on you, and I don't know what else to do.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Fiducia. It's good to bring that up. And then I would just encourage Ms. Red to, I know one of the questions was like, some people got it, some people didn't. So I was just wondering if they can forward that to the whole board so everybody understands the context that was written. Just for those that didn't get it, I'm not trying to instigate anything or anything. I just want to address that because some folks did get it, some folks didn't. So I just would encourage that communication back and forth. And Mr. Kelly has his hand up. Thank you, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chairman. What Mike Dunn wrote in that text was absolutely disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. No public official ought to ever say anything like that. I mean, Frank responded with an email to Dorothy that explained the errors, and that was a much more intelligent approach.
Yes.
What Mike Dunn did was disgusting.
Yes.
But Mike Shablasky has nothing to do with it. Mike Shablasky's a quality guy. He led Transform Rockford for several years. He was hired by Tom Gendron, the president of Woodward Governor, to do that, to try and help Rockford recover. You know, he's a quality guy. Regardless of whether Mike Dunn wanted him or not, he's a good appointment.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to echo what Mr. Kelly just said. Let's not punish Mr. Shablasky for Mr. Dunn's horrible lack of judgment. I don't condone. I don't think it's right. It's not the first time he's done that. But that aside, this appointment is about Mike Shablasky, and I think he is the kind of guy who will take Mr. Dunn to task, to challenge him on decisions like that when he does wrong things. So I agree with Mr. Kelly. Hopefully this doesn't reflect poorly on Mr. Shablasky.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Any other comments, questions?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Angie Gorel.
Okay, go ahead, and then Mr. Arena. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Mr. Shablasky is a wonderful person, and he's done a lot of nice things. But as far as I'm concerned, Mr. Dunn is the one who has soured me just terrible on Mr. Shablasky. We've been excusing Mr. Dunn for years, and I mean years, for this attitude and the things he says. How much longer are we going to continue to bow down to him and yet listen to his insults? I'm sorry. There's no way I'm going to vote for this man. I'm sure he's very qualified, but Mr. Dunn has killed my feelings towards that gentleman and that seat. There's no excuse, like Mr. Kelly said, for someone in that position or any position to be that crude and that, I'm going to use the word ignorant, to talk to people, text people, even text her. He put it in writing to her. Doesn't speak much for Mr. Dunn other than he's a great person for running the airport. It has nothing. It doesn't help his character at all. And I'm sorry, but I'm tired of Mr. Dunn having his nose in our business on the county board. We are Democrats. We are Republicans. We are not a party for Mr. Dunn. He owes Dorothy an apology. He owes us, the county board. That was an insult, not just to Dorothy. That was an insult to all of us. And if you think I'm going to vote for Mr. Shablasky, as great a person he is, Mike Dunn has turned me off to that. And Mr. Dunn can say anything he wants about me, because the old story is, you know, I don't really care. That's up to him. But he owes not only Dorothy, but he owes our board. He owes it to us for that apology. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Arena and then Mrs. Red. Thank you. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did, I tried to send this text to the whole board this morning after I talked with Mr. Fiducia this morning. Everyone apparently hadn't seen it. So if I could just take a moment and read into the record what we're talking about. The text begins, I just read your pathetically stupid memo to the chairman, RE, the airport board. Please be aware if you did your research, you would know that there hasn't been an all-white male board at the airport for over 30 years. Since I have been associated with the airport and or airport board since 2001, there has at all times been a minority on the board. Judge Gwen Gelly, Reverend K. Edward Copeland, and now Leslie West. Your idiotic and stupid statements are actually more pathetic than stupid. Do your job. Thank God the airport board is not and has not been filled with the likes of you. Mike Dunn. Now, that's obviously, I think to all of us, very inappropriate. And I agree with Mr. Kelly's comments that this text doesn't necessarily reflect on Mr. Shablaski's qualifications. And I think the conversation for today is about the text itself and not necessarily Mr. Shablaski. So what we need to focus on here is it appropriate for the executive director of the airport to be selecting the board that provides oversight to his office? And so I'm not sure how we as a board interact with the airport board. I mean, we have this appointment, but my question is, do we provide any funding to the airport, or is it all self-sustaining? All the money that's paid to Mr. Dunn by the airport, does it come strictly from the airport, or does any of that come from us? And then lastly, if we approve Mr. Shablaski as Mr. Dunn's selection for the airport board, do we have the opportunity to recall him if we find that he's not providing oversight as we might expect to Mr. Dunn? So maybe on that last one, Mr. Kerlinkus would know if we can withdraw the appointment.
So I don't know if Mr. Chapman would be able to answer about the financing. I know they're a taxing body that we administer, obviously pass through the funds for that. And I believe we do have some arrangements from the host fees that we obviously give to the airport authority out there. But other than that, I don't know much, Mr. Chapman. I don't know if you could answer that question for Mr. Arena.
Yeah, in terms of the finance side, we do not give the airport any direct support. Through a previous board, we funded, or we have an agreement with the airport to pay them for a portion of the hangars that were put up there by, I forget the name of the outfit, but other than that, we have no other direct support.
So thank you, Mr. Chapman. I'll go to Mr. Kerlinkus on the withdrawal of potentially of that individual and at a later date.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am not certain of what the arrangement is for their appointment to that board, whether or not there is a recall. I can check on it. I'll look at the procedure, but as we sit here tonight, I am not certain whether there is a recall provision for the ability to recall.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, hold on. Follow up, Mr. Arena, anything, or you're good? Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Is it Ms. Goro?
As a taxpayer, I pay for that airport just like you do and the rest of you do there. When I see that we have a person that we can't vote out of office because of his crudeness and his inability to talk to people in a reasonable in reasonable language, do I really want that man running my airport? You know, we had two people before him, and one got fired just for the fact of how Mr. Dunn talked to Dorothy and his crudeness and how he talked to women. This is something that the airport seems to find people who, yeah, they're great at what they do. They've taken us way out into a whole new world that what it was. You know, remember, this was Camp Grant at one time. But on the other hand, should we bow down to people who are insulting to the taxpayer? Talking to Dorothy like he did was talking to all of us taxpayers. It wasn't just her. You have to look at the whole picture. And even though this person is, what came from his suggestion to our chairman, and then our chairman brought it forward, I have a problem with that. Like I say, I'm sure Mr. Sobolewski is a very nice person. I was at some of his meetings, but to have us be directed by someone, that's like us telling the airport what to do, what not to do, and we don't do that. But we sure give them money for their projects out there. We've given them lots of money. And I believe our chairman one time told me that if we closed River Bluff, that levy, he would split up between him, the airport, and the sheriff's department. So there's a lot more behind all this. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to let him, I will not vote so that that person can get on, because that is an insult to all of us taxpayers, not just Dorothy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gore. I'll go to Ms. Red and then Mr. Kelly. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Don has been executive director for a long time. Who hired him?
That's a good question. I don't know, Mr. Chapman, I don't know, or Mr. Arena or Mr. Kurlinkus might have that information. I don't know.
I assume it would have been whoever was on the airport board at that time. That's who would do the hiring.
Okay, so they're trying to stack the board so that he gets what he wants. It sounds to me.
I don't know if we could say that, misread, but you know, people can draw their conclusions, but possibly, okay. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to go in that direction.
Okay, I'm sorry. I've met Mr. Sobolewski. I have nothing against him, but it's the way Mr. Don texted me and with that really crude text message. Something should be done about that.
Yes, and that's why we're having this discussion right now, Ms. Red, and with this conversation. But I'll go to Mr. Kelly and then Mr. Schultz.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, Dorothy, it was absolutely disgusting. But this isn't about Mike Dunn's disgusting behavior. This is about Mike Sobolewski, who is a quality guy.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Schultz.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that Mr. Arena had a good point in terms of, you know, what I thought at least he was saying in terms of separating the inappropriate comments and just over the top, you know, statement by Mr. Dunn from the appointment of Mr. Sobolewski. And I am torn because I understand the point Mrs. Gorel is making. I think, you know, giving him what he wants in the context of such bad behavior does feel awkward and does feel off. But at a minimum, I would recommend to the personnel, you know, committee or whoever this body deems appropriate, that there would be some kind of a censure kind of a resolution that the board would pass that would indicate a response to Mr. Dunn. This has gotten into the public record. And as such, I think it deserves a public response from this board. And I also agree that it was not just a swipe at Mrs. Red. I believe that it shows a sense of entitlement and a sense of, I'm going to get from this county board what I want, when I want. And I think that needs to be addressed. I'm also, you know, listening to the comments. I don't know this candidate that's being brought forward, but the process of having the executive director select the board members, even if just for appearances, that recommendation should come from the airport board. and not from the director of the airport board. And maybe that's just a nuance and doesn't make a lick of difference because it'll still be the person that the airport director wants. But I would like to see the recommendation come from the board. But the statement that could be made out of, I don't know who drafts that, but I would be in favor of a statement that, we can't censure him, I don't think, but, a response from this board.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Schultz.
Hello? Hello?
Hold on,
Hello?
Mr. Webster. We'll go to Mr. Fiducia first, then we'll go to Mr. Haney, and then Mr. Webster's. Go ahead, Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't feel that, once again, I'm in total agreement with everybody, what they said about what Mr. Dunn did. But I guess what I've gleaned out of this, because I've looked at this gentleman's resume, I have nothing against him. And if that's the chairman who the chairman wants to appoint, I guess it is what it is. But it was brought up to me earlier that this is a big municipality area. There has to be other candidates out there too. And maybe, the consequence of this should be that we should at least, or the chairman should at least look at some other candidates, reference this, and make a different recommendation to the board. Because as far as I'm concerned, it's not about Mr. Dunn. I don't want Mr. Dunn to, what he said, to wreck the apple cart for Mr. Shablasky, if indeed the board does want him. But there could be other candidates out there, and that the chairman may or may not want to look at. So with that being said, I do believe the chairman. I'm making it not about Mr. Dunn. I'm making about the selection issue, and what about stacking the board and things like that. I think I'd make that my issue, and maybe urge the chairman to look at some different candidates, because I had looking at his resume, he seemed like he's moved on, a lot of times. And, I don't understand, you'd think if he would be with a company, he'd stay with it for, 10 years or whatever, but maybe that's just, I'm old fashioned or whatnot. But
yes,
I think if the board, it's going to be up to the chairman. If he puts it into the board, then, and the board backs it, I'm gonna, stick with the board. But I'm making about the gentleman, not Mr. Dunn.
I appreciate the comments, but let's try to keep it to what we're talking about, which is, obviously, I think this arose from the comments that were made on the context of those that text message and the appropriateness of that language. So I want to make sure that we're not steering, as Mr. Schultz and Mr. Arena kind of diluted the discussion of Mr. Shablasky, whether he, and stuff like that, but address the context and what can the Personnel Policy Committee do to maybe either address a letter with a reference of that text message saying, we appreciate your comments, whatever, we'd like to see maybe some sort of professionalism. Obviously, we can't censorship the First Amendment, whatever the case may be. I'm cool with that, but some sort of professionalism would be appreciated on that. And so I will give the floor to Mr. Haney, and then Mr. Webster. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Stelgado. I'll be very brief. Just to clarify the record, I did, of course, get input from a number of sources. The recommendation is mine, not anyone else's. I own that, but with input from a multitude of folks over a period of time. So this is a 3-year appointment, not a 5-year appointment. And I would also say, for the record, everybody owns their own words in this. I own mine. Mrs. Red owns hers. Mr. Dunn owns his. The appointment is chairman, but it is subject board approval. Happy to continue to have any discussions if you would ever care to give me a call with questions about the qualifications of the individual. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Haney, and it's kind of elaborated. I just wanted to make sure that we separated that and the context of that text message and what the personnel policy could do for that. So moving on to Mr. Webster. I don't know if he's online anymore or he is. I don't see he's online anymore. So any more discussion on this? So I'm Mr. Fiducia, if you could maybe send out some sort of memo, talk to the state's attorney if there is, just condoning the type of language that was said in that text message essentially to the board member, probably would be sufficient from my perspective, as long as it's some sort of communication dialogue that we have here, because it is a condoning language that was said in that text message. So that's something to think about. And Mr. Kerlinkus, I don't know if there's something you want to add, but
I just wanted to tell you that I think Mr. Webster's back online.
okay. Mr. Webster, I think you had wanted to say something right before Mr. Haney started speaking.
Twice I moved off of this and I had to sign in again. Anyways, just a couple thoughts on this. You know, one was
I think you're breaking up, Mr. Webster. We can't really hear you very well.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay. One comment was about Mr. Dunn making the selection of who he wanted. And I heard Paul make a statement last night, something to the effect there that surely in a county this size, there must be other people that are just as qualified, or even more so perhaps if there had been an open process on that. And I'm referring back to the county board appointment when that was made crazy wild deal there, having that with all the stakeholders being able to weigh in and all that. Well, this is just as important. This is something for the airport. As Angie said, we all contribute to that by our taxes and so forth. And so why wasn't that posted for potential applicants there, and had some meetings over that so people got to hear who the applicants might have been and so forth. And then finally, the other thing I would just say to this is that when the comment was that that's the way Mr. Dunn always is, or he's always been that way, that's a very, very lame excuse. And so I think that by giving the man the name that he wanted, instead of having a choice of names for us to choose, I think giving him the name that he wanted is simply rewarding bad behavior. And that's what I have to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hoffman?
Yeah, I'm going to just add something to add a little context to this. If you guys remember back, and I'm sure Mr. Schultz was, since I kind of yelled at him for about 5 minutes, when you go back to the last two elections we had on people's handouts, it was written on these two candidates' handouts that the county board members were all crooks and thieves and bad people. Those two people got elected, and we don't hold what was said. And we know, well, it was said that Mr. Dunn wrote those things on that election piece. And we don't hold against those two people that got elected. And now we're saying we're going to hold it against Mike Slabasi because he said it. I think that's if we're not going to hold it against the two people that got elected with stuff calling us crooks, then I think it's a double standard. And believe me, I'm not happy with it.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Hoffman. Any other discussion on this? Mr. Fiducia, I don't know if this serves anything to further continue. Thank you.
Thank you. The reason I put this on the agenda was because I had a committee member who requested it, and I felt that it was my duty as personnel and policies to bring this to the board or bring it to the committee. With all that's being said, I understand that it is the chairman's appointment. I do understand what Angie said. I understand what Paul said. I'm understanding what everybody said. What I'm looking for from this group is, I don't know what we can really do unless I'm gonna ask Dorothy if, if there was to be a letter maybe sent to Mr. Dunn, if that would suffice, or I'll ask Mr. Kalinkas, because I really don't know what to do, but I just think I think it was horrible and
Point of order.
Yes, Mr. Kelly.
I believe we have a motion on the floor to appoint somebody, don't we?
No, it's just a personnel matter discussion right now. There's nothing to be voted on right now. It's just a discussion, Mr. Kelly. Go ahead, Mr. Fiducia.
So I see, I don't know what to do. So I guess I'm going to defer it. I'm going to defer it to Dorothy, and and we'll see what she says she'd like to do, because I don't know. I think everybody's in agreement on this, but I don't know what to do. But I do understand Dorothy, what she's saying.
Okay, thank you. Dorothy, I'd just advise maybe if we could connect with Mr. Fiducia and then see if we help you write, draft a letter or whatever addressing Mr. Dunn's language, context, and move forward in that direction. Yes, Ms. Red, go ahead.
I would like to see this open up and see if there are any more candidates out there.
Yeah.
If it's possible.
And I think we'll have that discussion when Mr. Schabowski's, recommendation for vote. And at that time, I think either, we make that decision at that time, which would be next Thursday, to see if that gets opened up. Yes, Mr. Kelly, and then Mr. Arena.
Excuse me, I misspoke. The motion is orders of the day. That means we ought to get back to the agenda.
Yep, and we are. Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm not a member of this committee, so I can't really make a motion. But I guess my question for Mr. Kurlinkus is, we want to, as a board, send a letter to the airport board condemning Mr. Dunn's actions. Does that require a resolution by the county board?
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes.
If you're going to take an action as the county board as a unit, yes, I would say it probably does. If there are individual county board members who are, want to sign this thing or whatever, that is not put forward as using the term resolution of the county board, then I don't think you'd need to. But if you're seeking to take action in the name of the county board, then I would say absolutely you need to have some sort of resolution or vote or motion at the county board.
Well,
Better be unanimous.
Pardon me?
Mr. Kelly said, I
Better
think
it'd be unanimous.
Yep.
Right. So I think that
Be unanimous.
as a board, we should defend against this type of treatment to any one of our members. And I would request that the Personnel and Policy Committee move forward on a formal resolution so that we all may, as a unit, make it clear that none of us should be spoken to as Ms. Red was. Thank you.
Hello?
Okay, Mr. Salgado,
Hold on, Mr. Webster. Go ahead, Mr. Fiducia.
Yeah.
if I guess that would be appropriate that we could take action at this time, but it's not on the agenda.
Correct. So next,
What I can do is I can talk with Mr. Kalinkas and Mr. Chapman. We can put that out. We can put that on the agenda, and maybe we could have a quick meeting before the county board meeting on Thursday, and we could have the correspondence drafted up so everybody could see it, and do it that way. Because once again, it's I don't know. You know what? It's just just window dressing, because it just I think Mrs. Crosby said what she said the other night was true, and it's not, I don't know what to do, but I will do that if this, if that's what if we'd want. I will go ahead and put that on a resolution.
Thank you for Mr. Fiducia, and I think that's probably the proper avenue to go in that direction. Mr. Webster, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I would second that notion of drawing up a resolution and the board members sign off on that.
Okay.
So I fully agree. I think it is. I think it is, in all due respect, Mr. Fiducia, I do think this is more than just window dressing. I think it's important that we do something like this because we're not going to be sitting here taking pot shots from other officials countywide. We get enough negative stuff coming at us there from newspaper from time to time, and this is the time for us to speak up for one of our own. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. So I believe we have direction. Mr. Fiducia, let's follow up that direction and move forward with that. So
I'll do that.
All right. Any other comments so we can move on to our next item? Seeing none, we'll move on to other matters. Are there any other matters? Seeing none, can I, Mr. Chapman, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would request that we close the meeting to discuss collective bargaining matters, please.
Okay, so there's a motion. Can I get a motion to go into closed session? Is that correct, Mr. Kurlinkus? Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. So can I get a motion to go into closed session? Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Gurl. So the floor, we're on the floor to discuss on closed session. Discussion on going into closed session. See none. I'm going to take a roll call on this, and this is for collective bargaining. So give me 1 second here. Mr. Salgado, yes. Mr. Fiducia.
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman.
Yes.
Mr. Gurl.
Yes.
Mr. Schultz.
Yes.
Mr. McDonald.
Yes.
Mr. Webster.
Yes.
Ms. Gorel.
Yes.
Miss Red.
Yes.
Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly.
Yes.
Okay, so we are going into closed sessions. So for those that are not board members, if we would ask that you please close out your Zoom, and then we'll notify you when we're back online.